you wake to the sound of flutes, echoing through marble halls, their melody sharp, unnatural, almost mocking. Torches sputter along the polished walls of the Palatine Palace, throwing long shadows over the assembled crowd of senators, courtiers, and soldiers. And at the center of it all, beneath a canopy of gold-threaded silk, stands the Emperor of Rome, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. But tonight, Nero is not the bridegroom in the way you expect. His eyes, heavy with kohl, lock onto a trembling figure brought forward by guards. The boy can barely walk, his face pale from both fear and blood loss. He is dressed in a bridal veil. The silk clings awkwardly to his thin shoulders, a grotesque parody of Roman matrimony. This boy, once named Sporus, has been mutilated so that his voice will remain high, his face soft, his body forever suspended between boyhood and something else. The torches flicker as Nero takes the boy's hand and raises it high, declaring before the stunned court that he has found his new bride. Some laugh nervously. Others turn away, ashamed or fearful. None dare object. Because this is not just a performance, it is a message about power, about control, about what it means to stand at the mercy of an emperor who fears nothing, not gods, not laws, not the judgment of history itself. What happened to Sporus that night is not a rumor. Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and other Roman historians record the spectacle with unease. It was one of the earliest and most infamous examples of how castrated boys became pawns in the games of emperors, and as grotesque as this wedding appears, it was only the beginning of a pattern that would stretch across generations of rulers, each emperor pushing the boundaries of cruelty further, each act revealing something darker about Rome's relationship with power and the human body. Before diving deeper into these hidden histories of suffering and survival, if you enjoy learning about the unsettling truths behind empires, consider subscribing and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing this community stretch across time and place. The story of castrated boys under Roman emperors is not just one of individual cruelty, it is a reflection of how absolute power consumes morality, how bodies could be reshaped into instruments of pleasure, humiliation, or symbolism. Rome prided itself on law, on order, on civilization. Yet at its core lay spectacles like this, where an emperor in the heart of the Eternal City staged a wedding that mocked both Roman marriage customs and the sanctity of the human body. To understand how we reached that moment in AD 67, with Sporus standing as Nero's unwilling bride, we have to understand the world Rome had built around him. It was the middle of the 1st century AD. Rome was at the height of its empire, stretching from the deserts of Syria to the forests of Britain. The emperor was more than a ruler. He was living law, the embodiment of divinity on earth. And while Rome publicly mocked the idea of eunuchs and castrated servants, considering it an Eastern corruption, they also could not escape their fascination with them. Greek influence had already introduced the practice into elite households. Castrated boys were considered useful precisely because they could not rival their masters, nor form dynasties of their own. They were seen as safe, pliable, malleable, and when power rests in the hands of one man, the emperor, the temptation to twist lives into symbols becomes irresistible. Nero's reign was infamous for its theatricality. He fancied himself a singer, an actor, a divine artist, but he was also haunted by paranoia and consumed by appetite. Sporus, the boy he chose to mutilate, was not chosen at random. Roman historians tell us that Nero saw in him a resemblance to his late wife Poppaea Sabina, who had died under suspicious circumstances, possibly struck by Nero himself in a fit of rage. The boy's soft features, his delicate frame, reminded Nero of her, and so he ordered surgeons to perform what Roman law explicitly forbade: the castration of a freeborn youth. The procedure itself was crude and horrifying. Rome lacked the surgical instruments of later civilizations. Castration could mean the removal of just the testes, or, in harsher cases, the full emasculation of the genitals. Both methods carried immense risk of infection, shock, or death. Sporus survived, though we do not know how. Perhaps the surgeons were skilled, or perhaps sheer chance spared him. What we do know is that his survival condemned him to a life more unbearable than death. After the wedding, Nero paraded Sporus as his empress, even traveling through Greece and the eastern provinces with the boy by his side. Ancient sources describe Sporus being treated with the full honors of an imperial consort, addressed as Sabina, carried in a litter, dressed in jewels. It was a spectacle designed not just for Nero's private fantasy, but for Rome itself. It mocked the institution of marriage, defied Roman masculinity, and reduced a boy to a living symbol of imperial indulgence. And yet, the cruelty was not just Nero's whim, it was embedded in the politics of spectacle. By flaunting Sporus, Nero was sending a message to his enemies: he could remake reality itself. If he wanted a dead wife reborn, he would take a living boy and mutilate him into her image. If he wanted the Roman elite to bow before this mockery of tradition, they would bow. The empire was whatever Nero declared it to be. But Sporus's story did not end with Nero's death in AD 68. When Nero was overthrown and forced to commit suicide, Sporus fell into the hands of other powerful men. Otho, who briefly became emperor, took Sporus as his own companion. Then came Vitellius, who humiliated Sporus further by threatening to make him reenact the rape of Persephone in public theatre, a grotesque spectacle of violation. Faced with this, Sporus chose suicide, opening his veins rather than enduring one more transformation of his body into imperial entertainment. His death is recorded quietly in the annals of Rome, but it speaks volumes. Sporus had survived the surgeon's knife, the emperor's bed, the jeers of the court, but he could not survive Rome's endless appetite for cruelty. Nero's act was not an isolated case. It was the spark that revealed what emperors could do once freed from all restraint. The boy's mutilation, marriage, and eventual death opened a grim path that later emperors would follow. Domitian would take eunuchs as personal attendants and cultivate fear through their presence. Commodus would orchestrate games where mutilated boys became props in his spectacles. And Elagabalus, in the 3rd century, would turn castration itself into a twisted religious offering, surrounding himself with mutilated youths as part of his cult of the Syrian sun god. Each case grew darker, more elaborate, more entangled with Rome's politics of spectacle, and each time the bodies of boys bore the price. The marble halls of the Palatine did not fall silent after Nero's death. Rome shifted emperors as easily as a gambler rolls dice, but the hunger for spectacle and control remained. The knife that cut Sporus was only the first incision. The wound it opened in Rome's moral flesh never healed. By the reign of Domitian, some 2 decades later, whispers of eunuchs had grown louder in the imperial court. Unlike Nero, Domitian did not cloak himself in theatrical performances. He styled himself as stern, divine, Jupiter reborn in human form. Yet behind that iron mask of discipline lay the same obsession with domination, played out in darker, quieter corridors. Domitian's palace was notorious for its climate of fear. Suetonius writes that senators trembled before him, servants spoke in whispers, and even his family members watched their words. In this world of paranoia, castrated boys became both tools and symbols. Domitian surrounded himself with them, not as wives like Sporus had been forced to become, but as attendants who reminded everyone that he could unmake a man at will. The atmosphere of his banquets was thick with unease. Imagine entering one of those feasts, golden couches set around a black marble table, lamps dimmed, so the light flickered like a funeral vigil, and from the shadows, the silent presence of boys with unnaturally smooth faces and unbroken voices. They moved like ghosts, pouring wine, bringing dishes, never speaking. Their very existence declared the emperor's authority to strip away not just freedom but masculinity itself. Sources describe Domitian's cruelty as systematic. Cassius Dio claims he delighted in reminding senators that their sons were never safe, that any household could be violated by imperial command. Stories circulate of boys seized from noble homes, altered against their family's will, and then returned to serve as reminders of what opposition meant. Whether these tales were exaggerated by hostile historians or not, their consistency across sources suggests a pattern. For Domitian, the castrated boy was more than a servant. He was a living omen, a reminder that the emperor could unmake nature itself. Rome had prided itself on law, on mores, manurum, the customs of the ancestors. But here was an emperor who flaunted his contempt for tradition in the flesh of children. The cruelty extended beyond private chambers. Suetonius recounts that Domitian once staged mock battles at his villa on Lake Albanus, where dwarfs and eunuchs were forced to fight each other to the death with blunted weapons. The crowd roared with laughter as mutilated bodies stumbled and bled, their suffering transformed into entertainment. The spectacle was both absurd and horrifying, a parody of gladiatorial combat that reduced human beings into grotesque playthings. The silence of the eunuchs themselves is the most chilling absence in the record. We hear their footsteps, see their shadows in the descriptions of historians, but their own voices are gone. They appear as objects of ridicule, props in Domitian's theatre of fear, never as people. And yet, traces leak through. Martial, the poet who lived under Domitian, refers obliquely to eunuchs in his biting epigrams. One verse mocks a man who surrounds himself with castrated servants, hinting at the emperor without daring to name him. The joke lands because the practice was already infamous. Even common readers knew that the palace was filled with boys whose bodies had been cut to fit imperial desire. When Domitian was assassinated in AD 96, stabbed by his own court officials, Rome exhaled in relief. But the pattern had already been established. The castrated boy was now part of the imperial world. What Nero had begun in spectacle, Domitian had normalized in terror, and the line of succession would only carry it further. The next great leap into horror came under Commodus. The son of Marcus Aurelius, Commodus inherited the throne in AD 180. If Marcus represented the philosopher-emperor, wise and restrained, Commodus embodied its opposite. He reveled in debauchery, in blood, in transforming the imperial palace into his personal amphitheatre. From the moment Commodus donned gladiator's armour, he saw the entire empire as his stage, and in that theatre, castrated boys became props of humiliation. Cassius Dio, who served as a senator during Commodus's reign, writes with barely contained disgust. He records that Commodus maintained entire troops of mutilated boys and men, forcing them to participate in his games. Some were made to fight animals, others to perform obscene parodies of mythological stories. One account describes Commodus dressing a eunuch boy as Ganymede, the beautiful youth abducted by Zeus, then forcing the boy into staged embraces while the court looked on. The sensory details of these spectacles are almost unbearable to imagine. The stench of sweat and blood filling the amphitheatre, the roar of the crowd as boys too young to wield a sword were shoved into combat, their high-pitched cries echoing against the stone. The emperor himself, resplendent in gladiator's garb, laughed as if he were not ruler of the Roman world but master of a cruel circus. Unlike Domitian, who used eunuchs as symbols of fear, Commodus used them as toys. He staged elaborate scenes where their mutilation was not hidden but displayed. Suetonius does not cover Commodus directly, his work ends earlier, but the Historia Augusta describes how Commodus delighted in degradation. One story claims he once lined the palace halls with castrated youths dressed as women, forcing senators to walk through them as if passing through a brothel. The choice of Ganymede as a recurring motif was no accident. In Greek myth, Ganymede was the Trojan boy abducted by Zeus to serve as cupbearer to the gods. For Romans steeped in this mythology, seeing eunuch boys forced to play Ganymede sent a clear message. Commodus was Zeus, the emperor god, entitled to take and unmake whoever pleased him. And yet, behind the laughter of the crowds, there was always unease. Romans despised Eastern practices of castration, branding them as unmanly and barbaric. But when the emperor himself embraced them, no one could object. The contradiction gnawed at the fabric of Roman identity. Senators muttered in private, historians scribbled in secret, but in public they applauded, because to oppose Commodus was to invite death. Cassius Dio recounts how Commodus's reign grew increasingly unstable, descending into paranoia and cruelty. The emperor's spectacles with eunuchs were not isolated diversions, but part of a broader collapse of boundaries. If he could mutilate boys for pleasure, he could just as easily massacre senators, generals, or commoners. Power was absolute, unchecked, and terrifying. By the time Commodus was strangled in his bath on the last day of AD 192, Rome had endured 12 years of degradation. The city stank of blood, both in the amphitheatre and in the palace. And once again the eunuchs remained behind, silent reminders of what emperors had done to them. But even Commodus was not the end. The spiral of cruelty continued, reaching perhaps its most grotesque expression half a century later under the young emperor Elagabalus. Born in Syria, raised as a high priest of the sun god Elagabal, this boy emperor ascended the throne at only 14. His reign from AD 218 to 222 was short but notorious. Even in the scandal-filled annals of Rome, Elagabalus stands apart. Where Nero used castration to resurrect a dead wife, where Domitian used it to enforce fear, and Commodus used it for parody, Elagabalus used it for religion. The Historia Augusta, for all its biases, records shocking details. Elagabalus surrounded himself with mutilated youths, not as attendants, but as fellow worshippers in his cult of the sun. He sought to abolish traditional Roman gods, elevating his Eastern deity above Jupiter himself. And in this cult, castration became a form of sacrifice. Imagine stepping into one of his ceremonies, the temple lit with crimson draperies, incense thick in the air, the pounding of drums echoing against stone walls. Boys with shaved heads and mutilated bodies move in trance-like rhythm, offering their blood as symbols of devotion. At the center, Elagabalus, clad in golden robes, raises his arms to the sun. The emperor's face gleams with sweat, his voice shrill, almost ecstatic. The court watches in horror, yet dares not intervene. Dio claims Elagabalus even considered castrating himself, aspiring to embody the androgynous priests of his god. He instead inflicted the rite on others, demanding their mutilation as proof of loyalty. To the conservative Roman elite, this was not just sacrilege, it was an abomination that mocked their identity as conquerors, as men, as Romans. But the emperor was unstoppable. For 4 years he drowned Rome in ritual and humiliation. Castrated boys became not just servants or toys, but holy symbols of his new world order. The backlash was inevitable. In AD 222, the Praetorian Guard turned on Elagabalus, dragging him through the streets and mutilating his corpse before throwing it into the Tiber. His cult was erased, his memory damned, yet the echoes of his reign lingered in the stories of those boys whose bodies bore the mark of his fanaticism. From Nero's grotesque wedding to Elagabalus's blood-drenched rituals, the pattern is clear. Castrated boys had become a canvas on which emperors painted their darkest fantasies. Whether through love, fear, parody, or religion, each ruler used mutilated bodies to display the same truth. In Rome, the emperor's will was law, and no boundary, neither moral nor natural, could stand against it. The reign of Elagabalus did not begin in Rome. It began under the blazing sun of Emesa, in the province of Syria, where the boy was born in AD 204. His given name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, but his destiny was tied to the god whose priesthood he inherited as a child. Elagabal, the black stone of the sun, worshipped on a mountaintop above the city. In that temple, amid incense and drums, the seeds of his imperial vision were planted. He grew up watching eunuch priests dance in ecstatic trances, their bodies mutilated in devotion to the god. To them, castration was not humiliation but consecration, blood offered in exchange for transcendence. When this boy, barely in his teens, was proclaimed emperor by the legions in AD 218, he carried that vision across the Mediterranean like a firebrand. Rome expected a young Caesar to step into the toga of Augustus, to bow to Jupiter and the Senate. Instead, Elagabalus arrived with the sunstone of Emesa and a train of mutilated youths. Herodian, one of our main sources, records with astonishment how he paraded through the streets with boys whose voices were high, whose faces were smooth, whose very existence mocked Roman masculinity. He placed them not in the kitchens or stables, but at the center of ritual, dressed in gold, perfumed, lifted up as if holy. Imagine the scene in the Roman Forum: senators gathered in their white togas, soldiers restless, citizens craning their necks, as the emperor unveils the black meteorite of Elagabal. Drums thunder, incense thickens the air, and from the temple steps descend lines of castrated boys, veiled and barefoot, chanting in foreign tongues. To conservative Romans, it was as if the East had swallowed the eternal city. This was not mere pageantry, it was a calculated act of domination. By elevating eunuchs into sacred roles, Elagabalus overturned centuries of Roman contempt. The castrated body, once ridiculed, now stood at the center of imperial religion. Dio describes with disgust how Elagabalus surrounded himself with catamites and eunuchs, making them his closest companions. He writes that the emperor refused the company of Roman generals or senators, preferring the laughter of boys whose voices would never deepen. At banquets they reclined beside him, their skin painted with saffron, their bodies draped in silk. When the Senate protested, Elagabalus mocked them openly, declaring that Rome's future belonged not to grey-haired patricians, but to the radiant youth of his god. But the emperor's fascination went further. The Historia Augusta claims he considered undergoing the operation himself. He allegedly consulted surgeons, asking whether they could transform his body so that he might become fully like the priests of his son. Whether this is exaggeration or not, the fact that multiple sources repeat it shows how closely his reign was associated with the knife, with mutilation as both spectacle and creed. The palace became a theatre of blood and incense. Eunuchs were not hidden servants but constant reminders that the emperor's body and theirs no longer obeyed Roman norms. Their presence whispered a truth few dared speak aloud. If the emperor could remake the human form, he could remake Rome itself. It is here that the sources diverge. Dio, a senator steeped in Roman tradition, sees only decadence and madness. Herodian, less hostile, acknowledges the religious intensity, portraying Elagabalus as a boy overwhelmed by his Syrian upbringing. The Historia Augusta, written later, piles on scandal after scandal, some perhaps invention, others based in rumor, but across them all, one detail remains consistent: the emperor's obsession with castration, both literal and symbolic. Consider the festival of the Magna Mater, imported centuries earlier from Asia Minor. Romans already knew of eunuch priests, the Galli, who served the goddess by cutting themselves. They tolerated it as an exotic curiosity. Elagabalus seized on this precedent and magnified it. He declared that Rome must abandon Jupiter and embrace the god of Emesa, whose service required the knife. For the first time, castration was not a foreign aberration tolerated at the edges of the empire, it was thrust into the sacred heart of Roman religion. The ceremony shocked even hardened citizens. Dio describes boys dancing until they collapsed in exhaustion, their wounds reopened by ritual cuts, their blood smeared on the altar. The smell of iron and incense mingled in the air, a stench of devotion and decay, and at the center, the emperor, crowned in jewels, cried out to the sun as if his own soul were being torn open. Some modern scholars argue that Dio and the Historia Augusta exaggerated, layering moral panic over truth. Perhaps Elagabalus did not personally wield the knife. Perhaps the eunuchs were not so numerous as described. But even if half the stories are propaganda, the core remains: this emperor embraced mutilation as symbol, spectacle, and sacrament. The political consequences were immediate. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers, grumbled at being ordered to participate in foreign rites. Senators whispered that the empire was being unmade. Mothers pulled their sons closer, fearful of rumors that the emperor sought new candidates for his holy service. The turning point came not in the temple, but in the palace. The Historia Augusta claims that Elagabalus married multiple times: women, men, even a charioteer named Heracles. In one notorious story, he staged a wedding to a boy chosen for his beauty, parading him before the court, in a grotesque echo of Nero and Sporus. The knife, again, ensured that this youth would never grow into manhood. The emperor dressed him in bridal veils, addressed him as wife, and declared their union blessed by the sun. The echoes of Nero were deliberate. Elagabalus saw himself as heir not to Augustus, but to those emperors who blurred boundaries, who fused theatre and power. Yet where Nero's spectacle had scandalized, Elagabalus made it dogma. This was not one boy paraded as a joke, it was an entire system of sanctified mutilation. The court grew restless. Julia Maesa, the emperor's grandmother and the true architect of his rise, saw the danger. The Praetorians' patience thinned with every ritual. Senators stopped concealing their disgust. In AD 222, when the emperor was only 18, the breaking point arrived. The guard stormed the palace. Elagabalus was dragged screaming through corridors once perfumed with incense, his eunuch attendants cut down as they tried to protect him. The boy who had made eunuchs holy now died among them, his body mutilated, paraded and thrown into the Tiber. His reign ended as it began in blood, spectacle, and the silence of those whose lives he had reshaped with the knife. But the story did not end with his death. The memory of eunuchs, of castrated boys forced into the theatre of power, lingered like a stain. Each emperor after Elagabalus learned a lesson. The body could be weaponized, displayed, humiliated. Whether for lust, fear, parody, or piety, the mutilated youth had become a recurring figure in the empire's darkest chapters. And behind the lurid tales preserved by hostile senators and scandal-hungry historians lies a quieter truth. These were not just symbols, they were boys, their names lost, their voices silenced, their lives collapsed into footnotes of imperial decadence. Yet without them, the story of Rome's emperors cannot be fully told. The sources are frustrating. Suetonius, Dio, Herodian, the Historia Augusta, all write from perspectives steeped in politics and prejudice. They exaggerate, moralize, invent, but the consistency of their accounts across centuries suggests a kernel of truth. Castration was not an accident of rumor. It was a fact of life, one emperor's wielded like a sword. And so the pattern emerges. Nero, who used castration to recreate a lost wife. Domitian, who used it to instill terror. Commodus, who used it for mockery and theatre. Elagabalus, who used it as religion. Each emperor, a new face of the same nightmare. The reign of Elagabalus ended in blood, but the image of mutilated boys did not vanish with him. Rome's emperors, even those who condemned his excesses, continued to circle the same orbit of cruelty, spectacle, and desire. The knife hovered over the bodies of children long after the boy priest of Emesa was thrown into the Tiber. It is tempting to think Elagabalus was an aberration. His youth, his Syrian origins, his ecstatic cult, all make him seem like an outlier. But when we look back across the arc of the empire, the pattern is harder to escape. Rome had long tolerated, even cultivated, the presence of boys whose bodies were deliberately altered to serve the whims of power. Take Hadrian, ruling nearly a century before Elagabalus. He was remembered for his architecture, his travels, his consolidation of the empire, but in his private life, Hadrian was bound to one boy above all others, Antinous. Antinous was not castrated. Every source insists he was a beautiful youth, whole and adored. Yet his story reveals the same dynamics of possession, of an emperor bending another's life until nothing remained but symbol. Hadrian paraded Antinous across the empire, displaying him as both beloved and ornament. When the boy drowned mysteriously in the Nile in AD 130, Hadrian's grief exploded into the creation of a cult. He deified Antinous, raised statues of him in marble and bronze, and renamed cities in his honor. For Romans, it was scandal enough that the emperor had elevated a boy to godhood, but in whispers, critics drew connections. How different was this from Nero's Sporus? From the eunuchs of Domitian? From the boys paraded by Commodus? The emperor's desire, whether crowned in marble or mutilated in blood, had always remade youth into symbols. Antinous, beautiful and uncut, stood at one extreme. The castrated child, veiled in silk, stood at the other. Both were bound by the same truth. Emperors claimed ownership over the bodies of boys, shaping them into whatever reflection suited their fantasy. Later writers seized on these patterns. Christian apologists, railing against Rome's decadence, pointed to the stories of Sporus, of eunuchs, of Elagabalus's rites as evidence of pagan corruption. Tertullian thundered that Rome unmanned boys to feed its lusts. Lactantius wrote that emperors had mutilated the innocent, mocking nature, defiling what was divine in man. These polemics exaggerate, but they preserve a reality that Roman historians themselves often hinted at. The knife was part of the imperial arsenal. And beyond the palace walls, the echoes of this cruelty spread. Gladiatorial schools, desperate for novelty, sometimes displayed fighters whose bodies had been altered. Audiences gasped at the sight of men with high voices, smooth faces, forced into combat against wild beasts. Satirists mocked wealthy Romans who kept eunuch slaves as playthings. Martial jeered at a man who doted on his castrated servant, calling him neither man nor woman, but something worse than both. The smell of blood lingered not just in temples but in the arenas. Imagine the amphitheatre in Carthage or Antioch, the roar of the crowd, the hot sand beneath the African sun, and into the arena steps a boy, his body already broken by the knife, now armed with a wooden sword, ordered to entertain. His cries echo across the stone, higher than those of men, cutting through the noise with unnatural sharpness. The audience laughs, some with delight, some with unease. And above it all, the emperor watches, secure in his box, entertained not by victory but by degradation. Commodus had pioneered this form of parody, but later emperors revived it. Rumors swirl around Caracalla, who forced captured Parthian youths into similar humiliations, parading them in mock triumphs. Diocletian's court in the late 3rd century was said to be filled with eunuchs who controlled access to the emperor, their mutilated bodies transformed into symbols of bureaucracy itself. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 4th century, complains that Rome had become a city of eunuchs, their power greater than senators, their existence an insult to Roman manhood. The irony is sharp. Romans once mocked Persians and Syrians for relying on eunuchs. By the late empire, Rome itself could not govern without them. The boy mutilated for Nero's fantasy had become the template for an entire imperial system. But we must return to the heart of the matter. The boys themselves. Their stories rarely survive. They appear in the sources as shadows, as punchlines, as nameless attendants. Sporus is an exception, remembered because his humiliation was so spectacular, but how many others, unnamed, unseen, bled on the surgeon's table, screamed in ritual halls, died in arenas? Archaeology offers faint traces. In the catacombs beneath Rome, skeletons have been found with pelvic damage consistent with early castration. Their bones reveal stunted growth, fragile structures, evidence of hormonal disruption. These are not the proud remains of gladiators or soldiers. They are the quiet testimony of boys whose bodies were altered before manhood. Their graves tell no names, but their bones whisper of the knife. Historians debate the numbers. Some argue eunuchs in Rome were rare, imported luxuries from the East. Others suggest that by the time of Diocletian and Constantine, they were everywhere in the palace system. What is beyond dispute is that emperors themselves set the precedent. Nero had made castration visible, unavoidable. Domitian turned it into a tool of fear. Commodus laughed as mutilated boys reenacted myths. Elagabalus sanctified it, and their successors inherited the legacy. The sensory world of their cruelty must be imagined from fragments. The palace at night, oil lamps flickering, eunuchs moving silently through marble corridors, their sandals soft against the stone. The theatre, painted backdrops of Olympus, boys dressed as Ganymede or Persephone, their voices trembling as the emperor demanded their humiliation. The temple, drums pounding, incense choking, the knife flashing under torchlight as blood spilled onto the altar. Everywhere, the same symbols, the body broken, reshaped, displayed. The emperors believed this made them gods. By unmaking boys, they claimed to remake reality itself. Nero could resurrect his dead wife in Sporus. Domitian could terrify senators by parading mutilated servants. Commodus could parody myth by twisting boys into living jokes. Elagabalus could sanctify his cult by elevating eunuchs as holy, and the empire itself followed, embedding eunuchs into the very machinery of power. But the sources also reveal resistance, faint, indirect, but real. Dio's disgust is not just political, it is human. He writes of these practices with a shudder, as if he cannot believe what his own eyes have seen. Suetonius's sly anecdotes, Martial's cutting verses, the later Christians' thundering condemnations, all testify to the unease these mutilated bodies inspired. Rome called itself eternal, the city of law and order, yet at its heart, its rulers had built a theatre of cruelty, where boys' bodies became proof that nothing, not custom, not nature, not humanity, could resist imperial will. And so we must trace the arc further, beyond Nero, Domitian, Commodus, Elagabalus, into the later empire, where eunuchs wielded power not as victims but as political players. Eusebius records eunuchs, at Constantine's court, advising the first Christian emperor, Procopius, centuries later, describes the Byzantine palace as dominated by eunuchs who controlled secrets, armies, and treasures. The pattern begun in cruelty ended in bureaucracy, but the body beneath the robe was still the same, a boy cut before manhood, shaped by imperial decree. From the first scream of Sporus in Nero's palace to the whispers of eunuch ministers in the halls of Constantinople, the line is unbroken. Rome learned early that the mutilated body was useful, as lover, as symbol, as servant, as priest, and emperors, hungry for domination, never stopped exploiting that truth. The silence of the boys themselves remains the deepest wound. Their voices do not survive. What we have are the words of emperors, of senators, of poets, of priests, men who watched, mocked, condemned, or justified. The boys are shadows in the margins, their names erased, their lives collapsed into anecdotes of decadence. Yet if we listen closely, through the cracks of history, we can still hear them. The sharp intake of breath before the knife, the cry of pain in the amphitheatre, the whispered prayers in foreign tongues during rituals, the silence of bones in forgotten graves. These are not just stories of emperors, they are the stories of boys who were unmade, their lives rewritten by the lust, fear, and ambition of Rome's most powerful men. The torches still flicker in the palace of your imagination. Nero stands with Sporus, the boy trembling in a bridal veil. Domitian reclines at his black marble banquets, eunuchs moving like shadows around him. Commodus roars with laughter as mutilated children play out myths in the arena. Elagabalus lifts his jeweled hands toward the sun, while blood runs down the steps of his temple. These images feel distant, trapped in marble busts and dusty scrolls, but the truth is that history is not dead, it breathes, and the lessons of Rome are not buried. The emperors of the past justified their cruelty with religion, with art, with the excuse of tradition. They turned boys into symbols, into objects, into tools of spectacle and power, and they did it openly, in front of senators, soldiers, citizens who cheered or kept silent. We like to believe such things belong only to the ancient world, that the knife, the torchlight, the forced rituals died with emperors thrown into the Tiber. But power has always sought the bodies of the young, the temptation to control, to break, to reshape. This has not vanished with the passing of centuries. No parent in Rome thought their child was safe when the emperor looked their way, and no parent today should believe that absolute safety exists. Exploitation adapts. It hides behind new masks, new languages, new institutions. What was once done in temples and palaces can just as easily be hidden behind closed doors of luxury estates, elite gatherings, or faceless systems of exploitation. This is not to frighten you into despair, but to awaken vigilance. History is not just a mirror of the past, it is a warning. The mutilated bodies of Rome's boys whisper across time, reminding us that when power is unchecked, when the vulnerable are voiceless, cruelty becomes spectacle. And that silence, the silence of Sporus, of nameless boys, paraded as jokes, as holy offerings, as lovers they never chose, that silence echoes still. If we do not listen to it, if we bury it under the comfort of thinking, that was then, we risk repeating the same blindness that allowed Rome's emperors to act in plain sight. So let their stories unsettle you. Let them disturb your sleep. Let them sharpen your awareness of how easily innocence can be exploited when no one dares to speak. Because the palace torches of Rome may have burned out long ago, but the shadows they cast still stretch into our present,